All right, welcome all to our lunchtime talk today. It's a real pleasure to have here today Grace Hunt, who's been here this year as the Hannah Arendt Center postdoctoral fellow, one of three, and we'll be having talks from some of the other fellows coming up. It's a real pleasure also to announce publicly that Grace just was made assistant professor at Western Kentucky University, so we're thrilled that she'll be going out into the world in that capacity. She recently completed her dissertation at the New School for Social Research, and the dissertation was titled Affirmative Reactions in Defense of Resentment. A lot of her work is about the emotions: resentment, revenge, forgiveness, passion, shame. And today she will be speaking about Hannah Arendt and politics of forgiveness. So please welcome Grace Hunt. Thank you.
Thanks.
I just meant please welcome.
Okay, so what I want to do today, I won't speak for long, and so what I'm going to do is offer a snippet view of a much broader, larger project. I'm going to be talking about a portion of my dissertation, which Roger just mentioned, which ultimately defends resentment, or rather suggests that we might have good reason philosophically to rethink the meaning of resentment, specifically in the aftermath of moral atrocity. So my work looks at resentment as an emotion which might not just be a fixation on the past, a grudge held against the past and past actions, but actually a demand for respect. So that's the overarching project, but today is just really a tiny little peek into that project. And so while my dissertation really spans the modern period, I'm dealing with a properly contemporary problem, a 20th century problem, or rather a 20th century phenomenon, which is that in response to crimes that have kind of defined the 20th century, crimes that have been called irredeemable and unpunishable, there's been a shift in attitude that goes against our more retributive tendencies, and the shift in attitude has been towards forgiveness. Right, so forgiveness has been praised socially as what is best for the survivors. Right, the forgiving victim is able to start her life again without being determined by past violence. She's able to begin again despite the fact of moral injury and misrecognition. So the forgiving victim, philosophically speaking, is viewed as a true moral agent. Right? She decides, despite the determinations of violence, how to proceed with her life. Now, politically speaking, forgiveness has become a virtue, and it has been celebrated and promoted by state-sanctioned truth and reconciliation commissions. Right? So these are platforms created by the government in the aftermath of atrocities such as the South African apartheid, where the commission allows for victims to come forward and testify to the harms they've suffered. It creates a kind of historical document of harm that is unlike one you would get in the usual legal proceedings. It offers amnesty to perpetrators who admit their guilt. And so this is the scene, it's the 20th century scene of forgiveness that's been politicized that I'm approaching right now, that I'm thinking about. An example of how Truth and Reconciliation Commissions get viewed as projects of forgiveness is seen in the way that Desmond Tutu, the Archbishop who oversaw the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, infused the project with the Christian language of forgiveness. So he said, I mean, this is just the title of his book, but it speaks volumes to his view. He says there's no future without forgiveness. So here we see that forgiveness is the way towards repair, but also towards future relationships. Okay, so we get the sense that reconciliation is only available to us insofar as something like forgiveness is taken up as an attitude towards the past, but also towards the perpetrators. And I just want to say that while I think Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, TRCs, should be praised for the work they do at avoiding retaliatory violence, I remain suspicious of the move to view forgiveness as the only way towards reconciliation. I think it overlooks a lot of ways that victims actually create meaningful relationships to their communities in the aftermath that don't include any forgiveness at all. Okay? So I just want to define a little bit more what I mean by in the aftermath of atrocity, right? So I'm speaking of certain events, the Holocaust for one, but also the South African apartheid. So, and that's not to say that those are the similar events in any way, but what is similar is the situation afterwards where perpetrators who go unprosecuted and victims are living in the same neighborhoods. Right, so they are sharing spaces, sharing grocery stores, sharing streets. So what does repair look like in that situation where there's no separation between victims and perpetrators? So that's the kind of scene I'm worried about and thinking about. Okay, so I think the way that Desmond Tutu and others have praised forgiveness as the way towards reconciliation is actually rooted in a deeper philosophical problem, which is that forgiveness and revenge seem to be those dichotomized ends that resentment is caught between. So again, this is to return to my larger project. I see resentment as always caught up between this dichotomy of forgiveness on the one hand and revenge on the other, meaning that we either give up our resentments and forgive, or give in to our resentments and avenge. Okay, I think that this has been a philosophical tradition for a very long time, and it's only recently that we've been thinking about the philosophy of resentment. But I see it always as caught up in that dichotomy. So all I want to do today is suggest that, well, I want to explore this recent celebration of political forgiveness and ask two questions. The first one is, what does forgiveness really do, politically speaking? And is Hannah Arendt's understanding of forgiveness, as it appears in The Human Condition, amenable to that political kind of work? Okay? So, to get us situated within this standard view of forgiveness, I have a few passages I thought we could turn to. So in this political celebration of forgiveness, we have, on the one hand, legal theorists who see it as the right type of attitude to take up in this political situation. And among those, is maybe the most famous is Geoffrey Murphy, who's been writing since the 1980s about the political value of forgiveness. So in this first passage, he says that in addition to many of its other disadvantages, resentment can stand as a fatal obstacle to the restoration of equal moral relations among persons. Forgiveness heals and restores, and without it, resentment would remain as an obstacle to make human relationships we value. Okay, so here we clearly see that forgiveness and resentment are opposed to one another. They each make the other one impossible. Resentment is an obstacle to future moral relations. So I think this is a typical view, that forgiveness is seen as restorative of relationships and resentment is seen as something which destroys those relationships. And it's not just proponents of forgiveness that think this. The next passage is from Jean Emery, who is a survivor of the Holocaust. He was campmates with Primo Levi, and he was an Austrian essayist. And he wrote a vehement and righteous defense of resentment in the aftermath of the Holocaust. His claim was that society can't forgive on his behalf, and they are pressuring him to forgive unprosecuted perpetrators, and he just thinks that's an immoral type of social pressure. So he maintains his resentments as a way to protect his kind of moral particularity as a victim in the aftermath of this atrocity. Nonetheless, Amory understands what is so insidious and bad about resentment, right? And he clearly explains it here in a way that reflects Geoffrey Murphy's worries. This is the second passage. He said, and I also want, for those of you who are familiar with The Human Condition, I want you to be listening to the language that Amory's using, because it sounds just like Hannah Arendt's articulation. He says that resentment nails every one of us to the cross of his ruined past. Absurdly, it demands that the irreversible be turned around and that the event be undone. Resentment blocks the exit to the genuine human dimension, the future. Okay. And here we see another philosophical problem with resentment is that not only does it become fixated on the harm, and not only does it pin the perpetrator to the harm, but it's essentially backwards looking in its orientation, right? Resentment is always turned backwards, whereas forgiveness, on the other hand, is seen as this forward looking, promising, progressive point of view. Okay? So what I want to suggest is that at first glance, Hannah Arendt's work on vengeance and forgiveness as it appears in the human condition seems to confirm the view we've been looking at so far, namely that forgiveness is opposed to vengeance, and that forgiveness would be a way for us to reconcile with the world as it is. So in the third passage, and now I'm turning to the human condition, and the rest of the passages are all from the human condition. Hannah Arendt says that vengeance acts in the form of reacting against an original trespassing, whereby far from putting an end to the consequences of the first misdeed, everybody remains bound to the process. Okay, so again we have this language of binding, right? That you get fixed to the past, fixed to the harm, and that it is, she calls it a process because vengeance for Hannah Arendt is an automatic, measured, calculable, predictable response. It's a reaction that we can measure. It's essentially operating on lex talionis, an eye for an eye type measurement, right? Revenge seeks equality through leveling of the perpetrator's status, right? So it can always be measured in that way. Eye for an eye is predictable in that sense. So in each of these examples, forgiveness seems to aim at the restoration of moral relations, at the future. It seems creative. It stops what would otherwise continue without end, right? Retaliation. And so Hannah Arendt's view seems amenable to the way that political theorists are thinking about and valuing forgiveness. And certainly insofar as we think of the forgiving victim as someone who starts anew despite the past that tries to determine her, I mean, that sounds Arendtian, right? That forgiveness is a creative capacity. But what Hannah Arendt adds to what I said earlier, right, that the forgiving victim is able to act despite the social facts of misrecognition, she adds that in forgiving we act despite the ontological fact of irreversibility. And what I mean by the ontological fact of irreversibility is that Hannah Arendt takes it to be a fundamental characteristic of being that we cannot undo what we've done, we cannot reverse what has happened, and so we are stuck with this predicament of human action. That we cannot anticipate the consequences of what we do or say and how it will be received by others. Okay, so this problem of irreversibility, Hannah Arendt adds to the meaning of forgiveness. So, and let's just look at a passage that describes that. This is the fourth passage. The fourth passage says that the possible redemption from the predicament of irreversibility, of being unable to undo what one has done, is the faculty of forgiving. Okay? So forgiveness for Hannah Arendt is not just a way to start again for the individual, it's responding to an ontological problem of irreversibility. Okay? That human action cannot undo what it has done, and it cannot anticipate the consequences of its deeds. So unlike vengeance that measures its punishment against what has already happened, forgiveness in Hannah Arendt's understanding has a very creative character. And this is passage 5, where she says that forgiving, in other words, is the only reaction which does not merely react, but acts anew and unexpectedly. Okay? So again, we have this picture of forgiveness that acts anew, and revenge that binds or reacts or recommits to what has already happened. So in that sense, Hannah Arendt doesn't seem to be adding anything new to the conversation. She just happens to agree with the idea that forgiveness is what enables new beginnings, and in that way we might understand her, as many people do, as amenable to this political conversation about the value of forgiveness. But what I want to suggest is that if we look a little bit closer at the language she uses to describe what forgiveness does, we'll see that Hannah Arendt's understanding of forgiveness is quite different. I would even say limited in a way that political forgiveness is unlimited, right? So let's turn to the passage in question and see if we can if I can point you towards some moments where forgiveness in the Arendtian sense is not what it is in the political sense. So this is the final passage. And it says that trespassing is an everyday occurrence which is in the very nature of action's constant establishment of new relationships within a web of relations. And it needs forgiving, right? So trespassing needs forgiving, dismissing, in order to go on by constantly releasing men from what they have done unknowingly. Only through this constant mutual release from what they do can men remain free agents. So, of course, when she says men, she means human beings. She has this terrible habit of using sexist language unnecessarily, right? The English language has a word for, human beings, but she chooses the language of men. Nonetheless, let's look at the words she uses. She says that she describes forgiving as something that dismisses and releases, dismisses daily trespasses and releases men from those trespasses. It's a constant and mutual release that takes place. This sounds quite different to my ear from the kind of forgiving that is being promoted and celebrated in the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, where it is not a mutual release. It is something that the victim, as having victim status, affords the perpetrator. In the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, at least how we see it envisioned by Desmond Tutu, it has a real Christian element of mercy, of grace, and of pardon that seems to be lacking in Hannah Arendt's account. So the first thing we could notice is that this is a very secularized version of forgiveness. But the other is that it is a releasing and a dismissing of people from their actions. So it is Augustinian in the sense, right? You dismiss the act for the sake of the actor, but is secularized in a way that results in a kind of dismissal. More importantly is that she says it is to dismiss and release people from daily trespasses that they have done unknowingly. Right? This is important. This is absolutely unlike what is happening in the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, where it is willed evil, it is crimes against humanity that was done knowingly and willingly that is being forgiven in these TRCs. Okay, and I think my hunch is that forgiveness in Hannah Arendt is radically diminished, right? It is not as broad of does not have as broad of a reach as it appears to have in the political situation I was describing before. And that this view may be confirmed in her next book, in Eichmann in Jerusalem, where she, in the epilogue of this book, she offers this kind of strange retelling of how she would have said what the Israeli court said to Eichmann. And she says, because Eichmann decided not to share the earth with the Jews, we cannot be asked to share the earth with him, and it's for that reason that he must hang. Right? So we get this account where on the one hand forgiveness is a necessity for action, and in the next book it is made impossible by crimes against humanity that I find most interesting in Arendt's work. And this isn't to say that I think Hannah Arendt is trying to build a system of concepts across all of her works, that I think would be a mistake. But we will nonetheless have this moment where forgiveness is seen to be a necessity and an impossibility. Right? Forgiveness in Hannah Arendt's work meets its limit at crimes against humanity. Whereas in the political scene I've been describing to you, forgiveness finds its necessity at crimes against humanity. Okay? So it's in that sense that I think that Arendtian forgiveness is not what we're talking about when we talk about political reconciliation, and that forgiveness in Hannah Arendt's work forgives action and not violence. Okay? So that's where I want to leave it, and begin a conversation. So to return to my overarching project, I think Hannah Arendt complicates the story that forgiveness is the only way towards reconciliation. Because if what I've just said is right, forgiveness actually can't help us in those reconciliatory moments. Reconciliation means something different. Okay, so I guess that's all I'll say for now, and then hopefully we can hash it out in the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Grace. Let me,
You're welcome.
let me begin and ask a question, I guess, this way. You said that, as far as I understand it, I think for you, you said is that for Hannah Arendt, forgiveness is political insofar it deals with the predicament of irreversibility, which is a predicament of action, and in some ways, at least for Hannah Arendt, action is political.
Yeah.
We could work that out if we wanted to. On the other hand, you're suggesting that forgiveness for Hannah Arendt is not political, insofar as that it only concerns action and doesn't concern violence. And I think that makes that. I mean, it's a strange way of putting it. But we're having two different ideas of political here. One is political in the sense of action, and let's leave that, because that's Arendt's view, aside for a second, and let's understand it then as political in the sense that you're using political in your talk, which is a response to violence. And so I guess then the question is, in what way is the response to violence political or legal? And does Arendt offer us helpful resources to think through what I take to be the problem you're engaged with, which is the response to violence? I mean, is that the right problem that we're engaged with? Is that a legal problem, or is that a political problem, or is it both? And when is it one and when is it the other?
Right. So, part of what I mean when I say forgiveness gets politicized is that it gets taken up by a state-sanctioned organization that creates a court situation. So it becomes legal and political at the same moment. So I mean it specifically because usually we think of forgiveness as either an interpersonal or an individual experience. When I say it's political, it's because it's being handed down or sanctioned by a state organization. So it's political in that specific sense. And I think it's, so that's my first response. So it's not just political because it's responding to violence in general. That's not the way that it becomes political. So that's.
Well, what's your interest in forgiveness is as a response to violence, whether it works or not. Whether it's what's the worry about forgiveness as a response to violence?
Right. My worry is that while Truth and Reconciliations should be praised for all the work they do to curb retaliatory violence, I think it's a mistake to understand forgiveness as the only way towards reconciliation. And here's why. First, as I mentioned, I think it overlooks the very creative ways survivors actually recreate functional, viable relationships to their communities in the aftermath of atrocity. But secondly, if the point of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions is to give voice to those who have been oppressed by violent governments, then the idea that a government should then sanction a situation in which they should forgive, I think is an immoral way to treat survivors. So it's adding insult to injury. Right. They suffered due to government oppression, and now the government is telling them how they should react and feel about their crimes. So that's my worry, fundamentally.
And we know Arendt doesn't care if we give voice to victims after atrocities. That's a victimization argument that she doesn't accept at all.
Yeah.
She thinks victims should be strong, not
not
weak, and don't have to be given permission.
And she thinks the indulgence in emotions is always an inappropriate way to respond to the kind of horrors that leave us.
So are you critical of her on that part?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So
the way that this work figures into the dissertation as a whole is just to say that forgiveness might not be as helpful as we thought it was. Here's an example of how it's actually quite limited within the political realm. That it meets its limit at crimes against humanity. It cannot, and it's intended for daily trespasses. So I find often that people, when they are defending forgiveness, turn to Arendt, right? She says it's necessary. And I want to say, well, she says it's necessary for action. It's unclear to me what it can do against violence. And there's a lot more to say about that, and I haven't said anything about her understanding of reconciliation, which is where I know we're headed, but
What other questions?
Yeah, one question was that where does the difference lie between forgiveness and reconciliation? Another was more about the power dynamics that forgiveness creates among the victims and the perpetrators.
What do you think
We're only thinking about victims right now, but I was thinking about why wouldn't perpetrators like to be forgiven? Why would they resist forgiveness from their side? They would not want to be forgiven because that would create this hierarchy in which I'm going back to TRC, South Africa. I'm thinking about this book, Disgrace by Coetzee, and why the guy who basically rapes this girl, he doesn't want to be forgiven.
Yeah, I know that book, and but I can't recall what I think the answer is in that context. But I know that if someone came to you and said, "I forgive you for what you did," and you said, "Whoa, you're out of line. I actually didn't do what you think I did," right? It's forgiveness in this situation is premised upon the admittance of guilt, right? And that you have to be forthright about that. Now, if you, for whatever reason, are unwilling to admit guilt, I mean, Eichmann is a case in point, then you absolutely, within this context, become unforgivable, right? But I think there are good reasons why people don't want to be forgiven. One is that they don't think that they have done the types of harms they're being accused of. They think it's patronizing to be looked down upon. There are all sorts of reasons.
If I can forgive you, you admit that I have the power over
Yeah.
you to forgive you. I think.
Yeah, because that's where it's not even about not accepting guilt. Like people knowing what they have done in its full capacity with guilt. For some reason, I feel like it would be an easier position for them to live with that guilt than to be forgiven and.
Really? Okay, I don't know that narrative, but I'm more familiar with cases where, like in the book The Sunflower, where the Nazi perpetrator needs someone that he victimized to come back and forgive him before he dies. You know, it just becomes an obsessive necessity. But anyways, so I don't think I've answered your questions, I've just kind of engaged in the thought.
What about the case where the alleged perpetrator feels they're justified in their action?
Yeah, they will not accept forgiveness, right?
I understand,
Yeah.
but they won't accept the forgiveness because forgiveness is not appropriate. But nevertheless, aren't we entitled to look at their actions, including their justification, and try and, particularly if we have this sense that there was a wrongdoing, to try and learn lessons about how to move forward in the future.
Yeah, I think that people can forgive an action or an actor without the actor's participation, right? I think that plenty of people often come to terms with what's happened by forgiving the act for the sake of the actor, right? By just distinguishing and saying that actor is actually different from his or her actions, and I need to reconcile with that fact. So certainly I think that forgiveness can be done without the participation. That's a more kind of unconditional type of forgiveness. Within the TRC, the kind of forgiveness that the reconciliation commissions promote is strictly conditional, right? The perpetrator admits to guilt, gets amnesty, and the victim forgives.
I have a follow-up question on that. Oh, wait.
Well, if he has a follow-up question, by the way. As long as you come back to me, that's
I guess my question in regard to the perpetrator participating in the act of forgiveness, I'm curious about the political role of apology and how it relates specifically to forgiveness in the context that we're discussing here. And I'm coming from the perspective of state apologies for slavery and what that looks like. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Just that a fundamental belief I happen to have is that you cannot force anyone to forgive anybody.
Right.
Right. It cannot be handed down from on high. It has to be, I really think of it as an interpersonal relationship. Whether the perpetrator is there or not, it is your relationship to someone else, to someone else's actions. So that leaves me not thinking a whole lot about apologies, right? Because I really am focused on the survivor, right? What do we demand of survivors? How do we view the most virtuous survivors? We view them as forgivers, right? The people that can forgive are the ultimate type of respondents to atrocity. And so even when apologies are made, that I don't think that means anybody has to forgive anything.
I think this is a point of information, a question of information more than anything else, but perhaps it leads someplace.
Okay.
Now, I'm thinking about the documentary Long Night's Journey into Day, and
Which I don't know.
okay, well, this is just where I'm coming from.
Okay.
My understanding is that there was a kind of conditional quality to the forgiveness or the amnesty offered by the TRC, and that's another question. I mean, relationship between forgiveness and amnesty, which I take to be a legal term.
Right.
What I recall from the TRC was that there were conditions for forgiveness/amnesty, and that was that the perpetrator needed to fully disclose what she or he had done, and that the violence that she or he had committed in the past was political in character. So that, for instance, a group of police officers who murder 4 people, and 3 of those people, let's say, were ANC activists, and they were murdered for their anti-apartheid politics. But that 4th person was not an ANC activist and was just murdered to eliminate a witness. And there have been instances where the police officers who were involved in a case like that were not granted amnesty. So I guess my question of information is, what happens when an applicant for amnesty is actually denied it? Are they then subject to prosecution? Or do they just remain unforgiven? And that's
And unpunished?
in a sense also.
I think that's a great question. One that I can't adequately answer. Because the people that I speak to about the TRC are talking about transcripts of what happened in the TRC, not what happened by the people that weren't allowed to receive amnesty there. So I don't have a good question, but a good answer. But what I find valuable about that is that the notion that the violence had to have been political, which again is another way of thinking of the forgiveness as being a political gesture as well. Although the testimony that I read and relate to is really interpersonal acts of forgiveness. They're looking at the perpetrator in the face and saying, I forgive what you did to my family, and it's not, nobody's mentioning because it was political. But yeah, that's, I think, a good addition.
This might not be a super helpful tangent, except that it's on my brain because of some of the talks we've had here about Arendt's Judaism recently, which is that one of the things that you said repeatedly in your description of Arendt's account was that this was a more secular account, or a secularized account.
Those,
and-
sorry.
Go ahead.
Those are her words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was suspicious of them when she said them too. Which is to say, what is it that makes an account more secular, and why does it matter? Not, I can think of lots of reasons why it might matter, but why does it matter in your framework? Because to me, this reads like there's a reason she chooses the word trespassing. Because forgive us our daily trespasses.
Yeah, and she
is
uses
the German
that, yeah.
Lutheran formulation of the Lord's Prayer.
Right.
And she talks about Jesus.
I know, she
You
really
know,
does.
so-
And yeah, that is a good tension.
So what makes this a more secular account?
Despite all of her references to Jesus and
Jesus and
all-
Augustine
yeah,
and Luke.
yeah, exactly.
Like the whole section is just Christian, like
Right.
a history of Christian teaching.
Right.
Forgiveness.
And what makes it secular is precisely that she's talking about forgiveness as an ontological remedy to irreversibility, right? That it is a, what's that?
So the question. That's Luke's formulation.
Well, we pardon people. I think, yeah, okay, I see where you're pushing me. Yeah, I guess I'm just compelled by the fact that forgiveness is the remedy for irreversibility, and that doesn't sound really religious to me at all. It sounds like a structure of human action, right? So I get drawn into that language of action rather than, even though I know it's modeled after, like, forgive us our daily trespasses, right? It is based on that, but it is applied politically in a secularized way. I think she does that just to let us know that you don't have to be a believer to know what, or to see the value in this type of dismissal and release that's available to us through forgiveness.
That got to the second part of my question.
Okay.
If you could say a little bit more about it, which is that what is the stake of its secularity for you? Whether it's a successful secularity or a failed secularity, why is
What are the stakes for me?
Or for your version of this argument?
Well,
I think it's for you. I think it's the
thanks.
universalness of the concept of forgiveness that you're going for. I think you want, like, let me see if I pick this up.
yeah.
That the forgiveness of TRC, or the political forgiveness, is too confined for you, and you think Arendt's got something broader. And that's part of the problem with it being anything but secular. And I agree. I mean, I don't know enough about Arendt, frankly, to really weigh in too much on this. Except number 6 seems to me like, getting back to about the last question. To me, I read that as just like almost straight up social theory, and it's totally devoid of any religious reference or anything.
Except
I know the trespassing, but it's like a theory of how we go on and bumping into each other all day long, and how we continue and so on. So I can appreciate on that level. I don't know what it does, but I think for you, what it does is it makes it broadens its applicability. I don't bore you.
No,
I have another question when you answer this one.
Okay. I mean, I think the passage 6 points precisely to the tension Ian is mentioning, right? That it's in all of its secular meanings, it's using all this religious language, right, from the Bible, right? My worry about the religious version of forgiveness, like the Christian, I guess it's Abrahamic, right? It's all three of the major religions use it. My worry is a practical one, that in the context of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, South Africans already have a concept of civility that could have been easily and was used. Ubuntu, right? Like this is their South African ethical concept for how to hold people responsible while remaining civil. It's a very broad concept. But it just strikes me as inappropriate to be channeling the Christian language of forgiveness in a situation where many of the testimonies are not going to be given in English, and certainly not by Christians. So I'm troubled by the kind of co-opting of an interpersonal relation into the language of a Christian relationship for the purposes of a political venture. Right? So those are some of my suspicions. That is to say nothing about the tension you've mentioned, except that I think it's a productive tension. And yeah, that's all.
Can I just ask to make one comment or question to Ian and you about this question of Christianity? Forgive us for our trespasses. That's a request of God, right? I mean, in the Christian understanding. And for her, I think the secularity, and this goes to the question of action, is that forgiveness for her is not a political relation, it's a theological relation. And therefore forgiveness has no role in politics. And this chapter on forgiveness, the hard part for me to understand of this chapter on forgiveness is that it's a chapter on forgiveness where she wants to say forgiveness is political, but what she's really not talking about is forgiveness. No, she's talking about dismissal.
Yeah.
Aphinai. She says what she says is the translation of the Greek.
Yeah.
Aphinai as forgiveness is a mistranslation, and what it really means is a release by God. I mean, not a mutual release. Yeah. And so there's a way in which she's trying to, in a sense, push away the theological and hold on to what she sees as a secular you put it ontological term. So, just a comment. I think let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But we can move on. And Tomas wants to answer.
And in quote 6, the constant establishment of new relationship, the constant mutual release, all kind of adds to this. We need to call it secular, but not theological,
Right.
maybe.
Yeah.
Understanding of the respective relationships. If you had a follow-up question in this discussion, because I had a slightly different angle I would like to.
I think
open.
I don't know how much more related it'll be than yours, but I'll try. Just in your, if I heard everything correctly, you're looking for something, and I think that the last answer about Ubuntu follows up on, confirms this. You're looking for something other than forgiveness as a way to, I think as a way to reconcile, but just as a way forward.
Yeah.
In part because you don't think it should be shoved on anybody, but also because of its limitations.
Right.
So, as an Arendt scholar, I'm going to ask you the following. In the fifth quote, she talks. This says there is a value on the concept of forgiveness for being unexpected. It's the only unexpected reaction. What is the importance for Arendt of it being unexpected? If anybody can jump in and answer, and assuming that really is important as distinguishing it. If you're looking for something else, does that value exist there too, or what are you losing by giving up forgiveness?
I see. Right. So maybe a bit of context will help answer the question about the value of unexpectedness. Right. So Hannah Arendt's writing in a time where she's very worried about mass complacency, mass conformity. Where things like the Holocaust were able to happen because relationships are bureaucratized and no one needs to take responsibility, nobody's really looking each other in the face. So she's responding to all those kinds of worries, right? So it's out of a worry about mass complacency and routinization, if that's a word, right? That she is celebrating the type of actions that interrupt the ordinary, the repetitive, the reactive, and create new values, right? And I see her as very Nietzschean in this way, right? Her and Nietzsche are very committed to critiquing complacent mass culture, to thinking about what new values can be created, and how plurality can be preserved. So it's a fundamental commitment to plurality that unexpectedness or creativity gets valued. So my answer about to your second question about what do I lose or gain or what's my way out, is that I think resentment is a creative moral emotion. It is not always already determined by revenge, right? So what philosophers hate about resentment is it seems to refuse forgiveness and want revenge, right? That the teleology of resentment is revenge, right? It needs or aims at revenge. I think that's a myth. I think I can prove it by turning to the texts where you think it's most evident, right, in naming Nietzsche's work. And so I think resentment is creative of all sorts of new demands, like the demand for self-respect, like the demand that a community acknowledge a person's suffering rather than trying to encourage the sufferer to be of a certain sort, namely forgiving. So does that mean that means that I'm maintaining a high value on plurality, right? I think that resentment is what helps maintain a whole variety of reactions to harm, and that we don't just need forgiveness to get reconciliation.
My question is along the line of you mentioned universality as a goal. I see it more as of your project. I see it more of a way of generalizing and drawing generalizing thoughts or reflections from the situations, the concrete situations that you talked about and that you mentioned in your introduction. A concrete situation after in the aftermath of atrocity, and I'd be interested to know more about, or to hear more about how the specific, I'm lacking of a good term because I don't want to say case, I don't want to say example, but the specific
Situation.
yeah, let's call it situation or counterparts you're looking at, or from which you start your reflections.
Okay.
How they, what's their impact to the way how you come to term your thoughts. So Holocaust is different from a TRC, is different from, I mean, if you talk about repair without separation, it's different from, let's say, post-segregation. So how does the legacy of those, the written legacy or the other kind of legacy you're dealing with, of those concrete counterparts, which get you to think about general questions of forgiveness, of resentment, how does this alter, your particular way of addressing the general question? Do you see where I'm getting at?
I think so.
So a simpler way to ask it is what's the significance of the real world, the political, concrete examples or counterparts for your reflection? Because they seem to be not showcases to illustrate something you think out, in a universal realm, but they seem to be kind of starting moments. So they seem to inform your way of thinking of that problem. So how does this impulse, what traces does that leave in your or lead into your project?
I'm still just trying to get a sense of what
What
you're
I'm
worried
asking.
about. Yeah, well, yeah, I think I hear what you're asking, but it's not clear what the worry is behind it yet.
There's no worry, that's the question.
Oh, okay.
Or an interest.
Yeah, so...
At the one hand, you talk about the philosophical literature on what some philosophical, and Amari would be hard to say it's philosophical, like Murphy or Arendt or Nietzsche.
Well, it's philosophical, it's not philosophy.
Yeah, okay. I agree. But so at the one hand you have text, at the other hand you have you think about
Right.
the world.
I see. Yeah.
And you think about accounts of those about those starting moments that get your reflection start, and that are very different.
Right. Yeah, they are, and I have even more examples that I haven't brought up. I think that my work starts with the way people experience and talk about how they recover from violence. That's always been the starting point for my work. I think because that's what grips me the most when I read it. It grips me much more than high concept work on the value of forgiveness and resentment.
Do you talk about people who recover from violence done one-on-one, or in court cases, or are you limited to big political violence like TRC, like apartheid and the Holocaust? I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. But I think that's how I understood part of this question is, why are you looking at, what does it mean that you look at these kind of violences and not a kind of murder or rape?
Right. Oh, and this is big. So the kinds of question I'm left with at the end of my thinking through Arendt is like, what transpires between daily trespasses? Like, what is between daily trespasses and crimes against humanity? It seems like there's a lot of room in there. And one thing, thank you for kind of bringing me around to the point here. One thing I'm really thinking about constantly nowadays is where domestic violence fits into Arendt's seeming model, right? Because it's a daily trespass, right? But it's not one.
By domestic violence, what do you mean?
I mean a
I don't think murder is a daily trespass.
No, but it's also not a crime against humanity, right? So
no,
so
that's right. It's
why,
a crime.
Yeah.
which is not a trespass, neither a trespass nor a crime against humanity.
Right. So I'm interested in problematizing Arendt's work around this question. Like, what are we to make of the meaning of all of these different forms of violence in between? But I don't think that's Thomas's question.
I think my question had a slightly different angle. I tried to put it again another way. Maybe it gets clearer from step to step. You're talking about rethinking terms like forgiveness and resentment, where there's a tradition how to, a tradition of understanding those terms, and say that if we want to grasp, for example, resentment, we really have to rethink and to read again how specifically this term and also the signifier is used, is written, is thought through. You close read. So how does my notion that I got was that you look at a plurality of ways of terming, thinking in the aftermath of atrocity. How do you deal with this plurality of knowledge in this wide range of different texts that kind of give shades to resentment, forgiveness, that we are not aware of, but that might be extremely productive, and especially productive if they come from the place where those atrocities have happened. That's, and my understanding was that that part of your project, or my interest was whether part of your project is also to, what are you doing with this plurality of knowledge?
Right, and I'm certainly not trying to systematize it all.
No.
I think that this is a project about plurality, and at the broadest sense, what I'm trying to say is that alongside forgiveness and truth and reconciliation commissions, resentful voices should be honored and understood as morally valuable. So I turn to experiential accounts, the accounts that I'm thinking about. I mean, Murphy and Arendt aside, I turn to Jean Amery, I turn to Susan Bryson, who's an American philosopher who was raped and left for dead and writes about the experience. So I'm concerned with phenomenological or experiential accounts of resentment, because I take it that resentment is an emotion we feel all the time, and it is operating in ways that we don't. We have some great accounts of what resentment is doing. Peter Strawson's essay on freedom and resentment is one. And that's an essay where he starts with the fact that we resent because we have been harmed, because we want to have been treated better. Now those are my words, not his, but I get that from those kinds of essays. So I'm always concerned with the first person point of view. That might be because of my pragmatist or feminist underpinnings, right? My education at the New School. But that's always my starting point. And I don't mean to generalize resentment for everyone from the particular, although I would say that I think people, when I say resentment, people know what I'm talking about, and they know it because of
they've understanding.
Yeah, exactly. So I turn to these texts in order to complicate the way we usually think of it, right? People are worried about resentment because they think it will turn them into this vengeful, retaliatory monster, right? But I think we actually have good reason, once we pay attention to these narrative texts, we have good reason to rethink its value. That is my long anticipated answer, I suppose.
You've been teaching at BPI, and I'm guessing teaching on this material as well when talking about it?
Unfortunately, no. I would love to, but I don't, no.
I was wondering if either, so then this probably more applies more, but your experiences working with prisoners has shaped, I don't know, some of your thinking and actually doing that directly. And I was going to ask if there's anything that while you've been teaching that people brought up that is kind of shaped.
They haven't, and there are confidentiality issues that I wouldn't be able to say what they said if they said it. So, but what I can say is, just to speak from my experience, when I got the job, I had to quickly reconcile with the fact that I would be teaching people that had committed crimes that I was kind of on principle totally against. Because as a woman who's concerned with the livelihood and of women, right, I knew that I was entering into a situation where I would likely be relating to people whose crimes are crimes that I've thought about conceptually a lot, right? So the case of Susan Bryson, her rape and all of that. So quickly put my resentments in check it quickly made me just literally check in with my resentments, and so that they weren't expanding out there into the world as I walk into this classroom, right? Because it would be very misplaced. I don't know what these people have done or what kind of legal representation they've had and all that. But it also reminded me that I really resent certain forms of American programs of imprisonment, you know, so it showed that I have demands for respect on both sides, right? Respect for the supposed perpetrators, but also respect for the supposed victims. And so my resentments sometimes get righteous, but they're directed towards the notion of justice that I don't find to be incompatible with EPI's goals. But yeah, it brought up all of those feelings, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you have anything to say about how we can reconcile forgiveness and resentment. As in, one seems like a lot to do with keeping memory alive, while other one seems to be killing it. And
Which
that's where the
one's
creative
killing
process begins.
Which one's killing?
Forgiveness. Like,
Forgiveness is killing the memory.
when you say creative, I'm seeing it as something ahistorical, as in like stopping it, beginning anew. But
Right.
that just doesn't go to what I understand being human is.
This is,
It
that's
wasn't
well
actually
put.
rhetoric of the TRC either, that kind of, about killing memory, that was
Right, the TRC actually created a historical document so that we could remember, right? So I guess reconciliation in that sense does bring together the need to remember with the need to forgive. But I think that memory is a central tension in this forgiveness resentment debate. But Jan, so your first question was, how do you reconcile forgiveness and resentment? I would just say, you need to tell me a story about why that's necessary, right? And I think people do say why it's necessary, but I don't. A colleague of mine writes on, she thinks about resentment as something which wants to recover, but it wants to do that without forgetting. And she ultimately, this is Alice McLaughlin I'm speaking about, she's at York University. She ultimately understands resentment as a kind of imperfect forgiveness. Right? It's a feeling that we have in response to injustice that is a type of mourning that wants to move forward but is always looking back. So she tries to reconcile, or does in her work, resentment with forgiveness. But I'm suspicious of the move to always have to tie everything up. Not this is not what Alice is doing at all. I'm very aware that I'm being filmed right now. But I'm suspicious of the move to always need to end with this progressive, forward-looking forgiveness type. That nothing good can come out of memory or rethinking the past. I think that everything valuable comes out of rethinking the past. So my project is not one of trying to reconcile resentment and forgiveness. But I think it could be done.
We have time probably for one question, if there's any other questions. Yeah.
Is one of your concerns that there's a coercive aspect to forgiveness?
Coercive is a strong word, but yes.
In the political context.
Yes. So the TRC has transcripts of everything, and this isn't to say that resentment wasn't allowed into the TRC courtroom, but it was to say that the resentful, angry, enraged, and justifiably so, that victim was often pathologized or seen to be not ready for the work of reconciliation, and I just don't think that's true or fair. So yeah.
All right. Please join me in thanking Grace Hunt. This is great.